Now, before I go into the functional anatomy of adult cerebellum, a matured cerebellum, let me tell you the development of cerebellum. Cerebellum develops from, if you look at the primary stage at 3 to 4 weeks of an embryo, the brain tube is actually divided into 3 segments. The front one, we call it as the forebrain or prosencephalon. The middle one is called as the midbrain or mesencephalon. The hind one or the hindbrain is called as rhombencephalon. Rhombencephalon is further divided into metencephalon and myelencephalon. Cerebellum develops from metencephalon, and this is what is my developmental sequence of cerebellum. Cerebellum, as we reach to 5 weeks of gestational development, we find that we have a area designated for the cerebellum. So if you ask where the cerebellum develops from, cerebellum is a part of hindbrain. Which part of hindbrain? Metencephalon. Okay. Pons and cerebellum, they originate from metencephalon. Coming to how cerebellum looks like, see here, this is my brainstem area. This is my pons. Here is the medulla. Behind the pons, we have this small brain, we call it, and this is what is called as the cerebellum. This looks like this. Now, if I unfold this, make it unfold, we will see that there are anterior lobe and posterior lobe, and one more lobe, which we call as the flocculonodular lobe. Okay. So anterior lobe, it is divided by primary fissure from the posterior lobe, and my flocculonodular lobe is divided from the posterior lobe by posterior lateral fissure. This is another picture to show. What is it showing? This is your, now I have not, that was an unfolded one, as if you have taken the cerebellum and unfolded it. You have just spread it out. When it is not spread, it is still attached. And from the lateral side of view, how will I get to see how my cerebellum looks like? It looks like this. This is my anterior lobe. This is my posterior lobe. And this is my flocculonodular lobe. And the fissures which are dividing my anterior to posterior lobe is called as, what is it called? Primary fissure. And how about the fissure which separates my flocculonodular lobe from the posterior is your posterior lateral fissure. This is the primary fissure. This is the posterior lateral fissure. When I unfold it, again, suppose I have taken it and unfold it for my purpose of study, and if I do the tonotopy means if I do the somatotopic mapping as how my body is represented in the cerebellum. So what is this? See, these are longitudinal, what you can say, outlines. I have unfolded my cerebellum, right? This is the anterior part. This is the posterior part. And here is something where we have the flocculonodular lobe. What is thing to observe here for somatotopic mapping is that our body is represented in an upside way. Here are the legs. We have seen how there is a motor homunculus in cerebral cortex. Similarly, in cerebellum also, our body is represented. So we have the axial body represented in the center part, right? Then we have our limbs, little proximal side. They are also represented in the intermediate zone. We'll come to know what is vermis, what is intermediate zone, what is the lateral zone. We'll come to know as we go ahead. This is where our face has got the representation. As we go little down, we got our body represented in this way. What does this mean? That we have an ipsilateral presentation of our body on one side of the cerebellum. So here we have representation on both the sides. So this is one side of representation. This is another side of representation. How it is different from the cerebral cortex? Cerebral cortex, we had the contralateral representation of our body. But in cerebellum, it is ipsilateral representation of our body. Now, this is the functional division of cerebellum. For physiology, we are mainly bothered about this type of division. Let us go and see how it is divided. The mid portion of it, the middle part of it, we call it as vermis. The middle part is called as the vermis. Then lateral to the vermis, on this part is what we call as intermediate zone of hemisphere or paravermis. Okay. Then still lateral, there is something called as lateral zone of hemisphere or lateral zone. Okay. This is forming my anterior lobe. So imagine here is the primary fissure, which is dividing the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Things that you have to remember is this lobe. This is called as the flocculonodular lobe. Here itself, please remember, this is the oldest portion of the cerebellum. And to remember here itself that it's developed along with the vestibular system. Hence, it is very nicely connected with my vestibular system. If you remember, when I was telling you about the vestibular system, I told you that vestibular system is connected to the cerebellum, that too in the flocculonodular lobe of the cerebellum. This is one of the oldest one, and its development is along with the vestibular system. Okay. Now coming to the anterior lobe, what is its function? Posterior lobe, what is its function? We are going to go and study.